Good evening. Welcome to the Producers Guild conversation with the producer and director of the Social Dilemma. We'd like to thank our friends at Netflix for making this event possible. We encourage you to participate in our conversation today by submitting your written questions for our panelists in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Simply type in your question and our moderator will do her best to present them to the team. Speaking of moderators, it is my pleasure to introduce ours today. Jazz Tangcay is the Artisans editor for Variety and a part of the Variety Awards circuit team. Welcome, Jazz, and take it away.
So let's just go back. Jeff, you and Tristan, who features in the Social Dilemma, actually went to Stanford together. And he obviously ended up ended up in Google. So did you know him at Stanford? And if you did, was he always interested in technology?
He always was. I actually had this very unique job while in college. It was called an Apple campus rep. And it was a job selling Apple computers at Stanford in the mid 2000s. And Tristan had that job, and then it got passed to another person named Jeff Seibert, and then it got passed to me. And Jeff Seibert's also somebody who's in the Social Dilemma. He's one of the early engineers from Twitter. And so I'd met Tristan in passing in college, but didn't really know him well. And it was afterwards, it was actually quite ironically because of a Facebook post that Tristan made that I heard him starting to talk about publicly about the tech industry and his criticisms of the tech industry. And it was through that process, I actually reached out to our other mutual friend, Jeff Seibert, to just get some info, like what is Tristan talking about? I had not heard this. So the first two touch points here were somebody from Google and somebody from Twitter who were, inside the companies and had unique insights into what these companies were doing. And that's what set us down this path to explore and to meet other insiders and to learn about what was going on with the social media companies.
Yeah. And you and Larissa have worked together previously. At what point did you turn to her and say, hey, I think I've got a documentary?
Well, we had just finished Chasing Coral, our film on climate change. And I remember telling her about this. I met up with Tristan, started talking, spoke with my friend Jeff and some others in the industry. And I remember going to Larissa and saying, I want to tell you about this project idea. And your response was like, why? Like, why are you making a movie about social media?
We've been working on climate change, one of the most important issues of our time. It's like, how is social media anywhere near as an existential threat level crisis as climate change? And boy, was I wrong.
Well, I think that was, I think the process that Larissa went through was the same process that I had gone through and many of the people on our team. I mean, back in 2017, when we started thinking about this, it was like, well, we all use social media. I was a very heavy social media user. I was all over Facebook. The last election, I was all over Facebook. I have like a really strong film community that I sort of curated on social media as well. And it was really through the early stages of working on this film where I started to realize, well, wait a second, like something's going on here and it's affecting our society in a way that I didn't fully grasp and didn't wrap my head around. And for me, Tristan was that first entrance into sort of like taking the red pill, if you will, and realizing we're all living in the matrix in this kind of invisible way, and not having known that or seen that or realized that up until those conversations, and then trying to share that and relate that to Larissa and the rest of our team and voice, wait a second, there's something going on here. This is a very, very different type of technology that's affecting us in a different way, and trying to wrap our heads around that.
Yeah. Larissa, what was your reaction to Jeff, say, as you said, like you've got this documentary and you start to see it come together. Like, how did you start changing your attitude towards it?
I mean, Jeff actually I think it was like 2014 or 2015, watched a TED Talk by Eli Paris around filter bubbles and came up with this idea, watching sort of the polarization happen, watching two feeds just sort of separate, of like, what if we could show how there's this breakdown of what we see as true? And at the time, we just had no idea, how do you visualize something like that? And I think that for me was this process, thinking, okay, Jeff has found something that it feels like it's at the root of a lot of our problems in society today, but I don't see a way to visualize it. And I think that was
Yeah.
really the struggle and the journey. And, one of the inspirations that I think we had for this film was looking at what The Big Short did for, subprime mortgages. So I never would have known what that term meant if not for The Big Short. And they so eloquently were able to help educate an audience through an entertaining storyline. I think Adam McKay's genius there. And for this, I think it was a very similar issue. For me, it was a learning process, understanding what this issue was, and then trying to figure out, well, how do we communicate that in some way that is somewhat exciting and interesting, hopefully.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that I loved was how you had like the algorithm control room. And that's determining like the son's behavior. Like, how did you come up with that narrative? So not only are you telling us these facts, you've got this fictional thing,
right?
I think, as Larissa said, to help us kind of understand what's going on.
Yeah, well, and Larissa's background here is like the perfect setup for this. We realized it was in conversations with our subjects that they started articulating, it's as if they have this digital version of you. And I can't tell you how many times they said this over and over. It's like, it's as if they have this digital model of you and they're testing all of the content in the world on you all the time. And they're testing what posts will work on you, and they're testing what ads will work on you. And as we were hearing that over and over, we just realized, well, wait a second, we can bring that to life, make a digital avatar version and demonstrate what's going on. And I think this is one of the trickiest things. It's like, what's happening on the other side of your phone? And how do you realize, like, each of us is getting our own completely personalized experience. I can say the word Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and something might come into your mind, but that feed is so completely different for each and every person who's on social media. And that was the realization, that the whole narrative storyline, it really was just a way to bring to life what these algorithms are doing to each and every one of us. And once we came up with that concept, we were talking about it with some of the different subjects in the film and kind of working on this metaphor and this analogy. And then it just sort of developed as a concept, and we couldn't shake it. I just couldn't shake it at all. There was a period where it was just like, I knew this is how we were going to have to communicate it. And then we were talking through different styles. Could we animate it? Do we want it to be live action? How complicated is it going to be? How are we going to cast the algorithm? We came up with 3 different main roles for the algorithm, because those are the main like actual algorithms that operate on us. One that's trying to figure out how to engage us, one that's trying to grow the advertising revenue, one that's trying to grow the network as a whole. So we tried to anthropomorphize those 3 like personifications, and it just kept unfolding. And then it was a really fun and challenging creative process to bring all of that to life.
Yeah. You talked about Larissa's background. Larissa, you've got to like just shift the slide to show everybody your background.
That's a great reveal. That's perfect.
Isn't that a brilliant reveal? I love it. Talking about your subjects, so we've got Tristan from Google, then you've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, like all these different people coming together.
Yeah.
Like talking about coding, how easy or how much of a challenge was that to get people to actually talk on camera?
It was really challenging. It was a whole period at the beginning. Well, first of all, there were people who were at the companies who I think still were drinking the Kool-Aid, and in many cases still are. And so one of the things that we were looking for were people who had been thinking critically about it and had new and interesting insights to share. And I think that's where Tristan started introducing us to people who had also been thinking about the technology and about the business model. In particular, it was the business model that we really landed on, and the consequences, the sort of unforeseen consequences of the business model. And then it was really just a matter of trying to find people who were speaking out publicly. I remember at the time, I have a lot of friends who did work and still work in the industry at a lot of different companies. And it was a really challenging thing to even just broach with people around, hey, we're making this movie and we're trying to explore these issues. And it was just really challenging to find people who were knowledgeable enough, had subject matter expertise, who were willing to go on the record. We did a number of anonymous interviews and kind of interviews just on background as well. where we talk to other executives, CEOs, former executives from companies. We were really just trying to get a better grasp on what are we really talking about here. And I think this was for the first year or so of the project, it was a lot of my time and Larissa's time and our writers and editors working together to figure out, like, what are we trying to say? What is the core critique? Because there are so many different aspects of technology that have had consequences on society. And I think in many ways, like the tech industry has now grown. It used to be like Silicon Valley, and there were a handful of companies in Silicon Valley. And now practically any industry in the world can use technology and can use algorithms and can use machine learning in really, really damaging and impactful ways. And I think that's what we're starting to realize is this industry has just grown in such a massive way. So for the first year or so, it was really trying to figure out what's the scale and scope of the project that we're trying to define, both the project and the problem. And what are we trying to talk about? And that's what took us a long time to hone in on this advertising business model. And I think it's the advertising business model that we see the greatest amount of kind of the greatest harm for a singular thing that you can sort of circle around and one set of core principles. It's in my mind, it's the same set of problems that have led to, it's the same underlying foundation that's led to all the problems through Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Instagram and the social and search engines.
Yeah. I think as a viewer, when I'm watching this, it really made me question how I'm getting my news, how much I'm using my phone. I've sold retargeting ads, so I kind of know a little bit about that in the background. As you're making this, both of you, like, how did you start to change how you use social media?
Yeah, I mean, this totally changed the way that I live my life. Making this film was an eye-opening experience. I think it even changed the way that Jeff and I work together. I mean, we worked together for over 10 years, and just the concept of how we communicate and what we choose to communicate and in what manner we choose to communicate, I think has really been a huge shift for us. I bring my phone into my bedroom anymore. I, choose when I want to look at my phone and recognize when I'm scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And at the same time, I still, just like Tim Kendall in the film, I find myself falling prey to the same things. And I can't help myself in some cases, check that email just to see what came in and swipe down, and hopefully there's a new message. So as much as I know about this issue, I think that these technologies are so incredibly that even the most knowledgeable people still find themselves falling prey to some of the design techniques of these software and of these platforms. I mean, Jeff, you were not on social media.
I mean, well, I've completely stopped using social media because of the making of the film. And I went from like heavy, many times a day addicted user to cold turkey. I won't touch social media. I've installed plugins called the Newsfeed Eradicator. So if I went to Facebook or Twitter, there literally would be nothing to scroll through. It just removes that entire feed. And I think the big part of it for me, there was this one moment when we were working on the film where one of our subjects talked about, he learned that Russia was pushing out anti-fracking propaganda. And I realized, well, wait a second, like, we've been working on environmental projects. I have a view on fracking. I'm not a fan of fracking, but why do I believe what I believe? Why do I think what I think? Where am I getting my influences from? And if you've spent the last decade on social media, very unknowingly and kind of invisibly, the information that you've been seeing on a daily basis has slowly been pushed in a particular path that has been reverse engineered for your own mind. And I think that's the thing that really just shook me to my core. Like, I was moving away from a sense of objective truth or actually factual information and truth-based journalism, and was letting myself getting detoured around information that was most responsive to me. And I actually did this, and when we were launching the film, I actually went back to look at my history on Facebook and Twitter. And it was just interesting to reflect and see what types of posts that I don't even remember now, but I reposted with great enthusiasm, right? Many years ago, I was like, oh my God, you won't believe this thing. And I can see the anger, the outrage, the emotions, the way I was being manipulated in that process to want to post more and more and more, because that is the business model, right? The more each and every one of us post, and the more, this was sort of an unintentional realization, the deeper seated the emotions are, the more well those types of posts do on these platforms. So just the very, I could feel my own victimhood in my usage over time. And one other thing to share, when I stopped using it, when I was trying to get off of social media, I could feel what we had learned about that was called the resurrection algorithm. So if you're a heavy user and you stop using it, they consider you dead to them. And this is actually the language that they use at Facebook. It's about a resurrection. They want to bring you back from the dead to get you back to the platform. And I was getting emails nonstop, and then those didn't work. So then it started to switch to text messages. And I started to get these messages where I could just feel them fishing, trying to get me to come back to the platform. And that was happening on this like very regular basis, different messages, people in the film industry, people, friends and family, a girl that I had a crush on in high school. And like the type of content that was being kind of presented to me just to get me to come back, I could feel how manipulative it was. And it just really turned, like, maybe not want to use them at all.
I think so many of our crew members too went on their own journey as they were sitting and listening to some of the interviews, really thinking through, well, why do I post this, and what do I feel, and how much of my personality is determined by the likes of other people and the social approval that I have in my group of quote unquote friends. And Jeff always says, like, it feels like Facebook has co-opted the word friend, because it's like, well, those 5,000 people may not be my best and closest friends. So I think it really has changed the way a lot of us live our lives.
I know, it's like, who has 5,000 friends? Like, Ross Babbitt asked some great question, and it's something that I love too, the ending where you've got the, the clips during the credits of giving suggestions on how to fix the problem. So how do we fix it? Like, I think, every week we get a report on screen time. It's like, your screen time is up this week, and you're like, oh my gosh, or like, I've clicked on this article, all of a sudden this is all I'm seeing. Like, how do we fix?
I mean, this is a really tough one to answer, because the scale of the problem is so huge. I mean, it is on the scale of climate change. It's like, how do you solve climate change? We're not going to solve it by not using plastic bags or plastic water bottles. As important as that is, like, there's a huge societal challenge that we have here. I think we need to really, really fix the problem. We need a fundamental change of the way these companies operate. I mean, these companies have gone completely unregulated for over a decade now, and they're allowed to take anything in from anybody and pour lighter fluid on any idea. I mean, not just weekly, the daily news headlines that are coming out about this misinformation, this disinformation, the way these systems have been used intentionally, the harm that it's causing to individuals. Like, I think this is the realization that we had when we were working on the film, that you can talk about teenage addiction and teenage mental health and increasing rates of suicide, and you can talk about political polarization, conspiracy theory, misinformation, disinformation, the breakdown of truth. These aren't separate things. These are actually all the same symptoms of the same problem. And it's this problem that has created this like manipulation machine where our attention is the thing being sold. It is our attention that's forcing us to come back to it. Like, we've been reverse engineered, and it affects different people in different ways, and it affects society in different ways. But all of these are part of the same underlying problem. Like, we're not the customers, right? We all do pay for our Netflix account, our Hulu or Amazon account, or whatever like entertainment account, but none of us pay for Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And it's this unfortunate reality where we are not the customer in these scenarios. So I think to the question, like, ultimately, like the deep answer to the question is we need to completely change the way these technology platforms have undermined our information ecosystem. But in the short term, this is where it is like the change your light bulb level impacts that we can have. We need to protect ourselves and protect our family and protect our close circles. In my mind, if you can get off of social media, you should. If you can't get off of social media, really try to find diverse audiences that you're getting your news and information from. Keep children off of these platforms. I think that's a real big thing. Like, teenagers are growing up today, nowadays, in an era and in an environment where their entire social fabric is being dictated by a company who's manipulating them for profit, right? It's not designed by child psychologists, it's designed with this profit motive in mind. And we're really just like rewarping an entire generation. I can go on this one for a long time, but Larissa, please, any
Well,
thoughts that you have
it
too?
is just like climate change in that it feels like the onus is on the individual. So it's saying like, turn off your notifications and, change the way that you use your technology and try to put all these barriers in the way to make sure you don't use too much screen time and all of those things. And the reality is, just like with climate change or the plastic problem, it's like we can clean up all the beaches as often as we want. But if they're still pumping out oil that's making plastic and putting that into our grocery stores and forcing people to buy it, then we're going to always have too much plastic to deal with. So I think it's mysterious in the way that we as humans try to figure out, well, what can I do? What's the one thing that I can do? And it's like, well, we need every individual. We all have to do each step in order to try to mitigate our own climate change, or in this case, our own information ecosystem breakdown. But the reality is, like, it has to come from all sides. It has to come from the top down. And if they're not willing as designers to change the technology, then there needs to be somebody to force them to do that. And that is our collective will. And that could come through regulation, through a public outcry. But I think it is, as Jeff said, it has to happen at every level.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that, these social media platforms have gone unregulated for so long. But as part of the film's release, there is actually an impact campaign tied to that. So do you want to talk a little bit about the impact campaign and what you're hoping that's going to
Absolutely,
achieve?
thank you. This is something that Larissa and I did with Chasing Coral as well, where we've really developed a team that's working with our company Exposure Labs. This is all an internal team that is focused on how do we best leverage the film for change. And in the case of the social dilemma, we really look at three main arms. How do we change the way the technology is used, the way it's designed, and the way it's regulated? I think those are the big opportunities for how we solve this particular set of problems. And as we were just saying, like, these are very complicated issues. We don't have silver bullet solutions, but really the focus is how do we elevate the conversation, just like as we are today with all of you here. How do we bring this conversation to different groups and different communities that are thinking about this issue, whether those are schools and teenagers and kids. And we've been having a lot of really amazing conversations with teenagers since the launch of the film, or that's with technology designers themselves, who are thinking about what do we need to do to change the way the technology is actually designed. And these are going to take a long time to see meaningful strides and to see the shifts that we need. But if we can continue to elevate this conversation and raise the significance of the issue, our hope is that that change can happen.
Carlos Garcia actually asks a really good question, given that our election is a week away. And we're in election season. He asked, how do you think technology and social media are going to affect future elections if unchecked? Because there is a lot of disinformation out there as we're having this conversation.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Do you want me to jump in, Larissa, or do you want to?
Please. No, you started off.
I was thinking that the way that we've seen, do you need? My girlfriend's grabbing her computer. Oh, good. The realization that we had a couple of years ago while we started working on this project was one of asking the same question around, like, where do we think this issue is going to go in a couple of years? And so as we were working on the original editing and the structure, and asking ourselves, like, okay, with the narrative portions that we're trying to build here, like, if this thesis is correct, where is this going to lead us? And the thought that we had back in 2018 was that we're going to have more polarization. We're going to have more misinformation and disinformation. We're going to have more partisanship. We're going to have a greater breakdown in truth. And this was just based on this thesis a couple of years ago saying, okay, what's going to happen if these systems go unchecked? And unfortunately, now in 2020, I think we all, our team feels as though that thesis has been proven correct, that we are now in the state of what the outcomes were of an unchecked system from a couple of years ago. unfortunately, I do think that this is going to just continue to get worse down this path. I think we're going to have more polarization, more misinformation, and disinformation. Those are defined very differently. And we're going to see more intentional negative usage of these platforms. We're going to see all of these trends in my mind are just going to continue if we allow the system to live unchecked. In many ways, like this is how our subjects kind of introduce the thinking to me. If you step back and like sort of fly out and you're looking down at all of human civilization and you see billions of people connected in on these computer systems, and you see that the system is incentivized to allow any piece of information to come in regardless of its truth or accuracy, and that it will spread all of that information as fast as possible because the number of interactions is the goal, because you can make as much money from advertising as possible. If that's the whole system at play, where they go in and they regulate just the really egregious content or the really outrageous stuff or the most hateful speech, still so much of the inaccurate stuff is going to slip through all the cracks. And you're just getting that replicated out through society for years and years and years. It was one of the stats that we put in the film, this research out of MIT, saying that lies spread 6 times faster than the truth on Twitter. And if you just, once again, you're looking back at that whole system and you see, okay, truth goes at that speed, lies go 6 times faster. Like the truth will never win in a system like that. And so this is the thing that has startled me and Larissa and I think our whole team. When you look at the way the system is designed, it is sort of by accident designed to break down truth, to break down trust in authority, to break down trust in journalism, where just what is a trustworthy source has been broken down. And then even if you take it to the level of what we've seen from the news out of Facebook over just the last couple of weeks or so, around how Facebook has intentionally shifted the algorithm that allows misinformation or conspiracies that are politically right-leaning. They manually and intentionally brought the algorithm there because they didn't want to exclude conservative voices, even knowing that they were allowing more misinformation to seep into the system. So it's a challenge where like Facebook and Twitter control now the information that the world gets. And they're not controlling it based on editors saying this is trustworthy, reliable journalism. They are saying, oh, we're hands off. We will let the algorithms decide. And the algorithms have intentions and purposes that are not necessarily aligned with our goals and our intentions.
Right. And in the same way, I think when you look at how, some of my friends will come up to me and say, well, I'm not on social media, so I'm not worried, I shouldn't be concerned about that. And it's saying, well, but yes, but you a world where the rest of the world is getting their information from Google. And if Google is saying climate change is space, fake, a hoax, and not real, then what kind of lessons are we teaching people? And I always encourage people, like, if it's not climate change, if that's not your issue, like Google something else, check a different issue and see what autofill results they give you, because it really is staggering the way that our information ecosystem is now totally dependent on we don't go to the libraries in the COVID digital world. We're not going to check and look at the encyclopedia. We're Googling things. We're not going to the newspaper and looking up every article that somebody sends me. We're checking out the newsfeed and seeing what my best friend or my cousin posted. So it has completely changed the way that we see the world. And anybody who says otherwise is clueless to the rest of the world, I think.
I was sharing with somebody earlier this book, Algorithms of Oppression. And the example that Larissa just brought up, this is the search. I mean, literally, this is the search history from this researcher, Sophia Noble. Why are Black women so, and then fill in the blank. These were the results that she got when she did this autofill suggestion. And the title Algorithms of Oppression is a really prescient title. Like, it is, if there is racism in our system, it is now being embedded in the code that's just being perpetuated through these algorithms and search engines. So this is, once again, like, these are big scale issues that that we're trying to think through and tackle here, but there are no easy solutions, unfortunately.
And what you say is so fascinating, because if you leave the country, if you go to, say, Barcelona, your Google search on exactly the same thing will change. Same with your Twitter trending topics.
Totally. And it
Exactly.
changes the way that we even like look at ourselves. Like you, like in Sophia's book, you know, she Googles doctor or she Googles rabbi, and what you get in the image results. Just, I'm a kid and I want to know when I grow up, I want to be a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer or a rabbi. Like the types of images that you get are going to define who you think you can be as a kid. And that information, it's like, who gets to choose that? Who's deciding that for me and for my children or their children?
Cara Mandel wants to know what kind of feedback, if you have you received any from the major social media networks. I have a statement from Facebook, the comment that they responded to, but
yeah, that's been the main one. Most of the big companies have not said anything, but Facebook did issue a 7-bullet PDF that they put on their about page, and apparently like got it out to some press, and there was some coverage of it. One of the main points that Facebook said in those bullets was, "You are not the product." And I think that's just the one that I think a lot of people on the internet and on Twitter in particular just pushed back on, because if we're not the product, if we stopped using these platforms, they literally would not have anything to sell. Like, we, the public, are the resource that they are selling against. So I don't know, Facebook's response was the most specific to date with their bulleted list, but in many ways, I think it was a very thin response.
And I think the reality is that, again, it's not any one individual company. I think it's the business model. It's the fact that any one of these companies is, as Jeff said, using us as humans as a raw resource to extract and to sell, you know, make money from. And I think that to me is the scarier thing, because it isn't about a single company. It is much more about the business model of all of these companies. And that's a much larger issue to try to tackle.
yeah. And at what stage did Netflix come on board? Were they on board from the beginning, or like, how did you get the financing from the film? And that's a question from the audience.
Yeah, we made the film completely independently, and we premiered the film at Sundance, and that's when Netflix came on board, was after the Sundance premiere. And I think that's something that Larissa and I have been very proud about with a number of our projects, that we've been able to pursue them independently, and maintain creative control, and really put the time and energy and effort into figuring out, like, what are we trying to say here? What are the big points that we need to bring to the surface? And just being able to have that flexibility has been meaningful for us. And so Netflix came on after the Sundance premiere. We had some changes that we wanted to do, and we were able to make some amendments to the film with COVID in particular. So literally, we were going through revisions and shaving some of the tweaks that we wanted to do after Sundance, and COVID started hitting right after Sundance. And then we had to both figure out how to finish the production in a Sundance, in a COVID world, and incorporate that new material. And it was really, we were just starting to see how, even at the very, very beginning, misinformation was going viral about the virus itself. So we were able to find some of that footage and incorporate that into the film.
I think we felt so lucky to have had the executive producers and co-executive producers and contributing producers that allowed us to make this film. Like, without them, like our independent film world would not exist. And then at the same time, having Netflix, which was able to give us global distribution to elevate this conversation, has been the most incredible thing for this issue and this movement, to allow people to wake up to some of these issues and then be able to dive deeper into all the experts and the research that's out there.
Yeah. And Kenra has a great question. If we are not the product, then what is the product?
Yes, I love this one. That's a great question. One of the subjects in our film, Jaron Lanier, this kind of like genius he's like a computer scientist who has spent a lot of time thinking about all of this. But he references this as what they are selling is the ability to manipulate the public. The subtle and invisible gradual change in our own perception and behavior. That's the thing that they're able to sell. And if you think about it, it's like Google and Facebook and Twitter have collected one of the largest networks of people in the planet. And what they are making available is the ability to persuade a certain subset of those people. And you can filter with great precision the types of people that you're looking to influence. And here's where, like, it's not so much the actual advertisements that are the problem in my mind. It's the concern is not the rectangle that an advertiser is paying for, even though in many cases, like, those specific ads are used with bad intent, or people are trying to manipulate through the advertisements. One of the problems is really just the fact that in order to be able to reverse engineer what Jazz is interested in, or what Larissa is interested in, or what I'm interested in, to be able to target us that specifically, it is the amount of content that they're showing us and testing against us to pre-filter us just to be able to do that type of advertising. That it's the feed itself that is shifting us and pushing us into our own individualized filter bubbles. Like, that in some ways is the main concern. It's really in some ways just a massive matchmaking surface, but in order to match you to the right person, they have to push you to better fit a particular type of description. And this is what the algorithms are doing at scale. Like, this is machine learning. I think machine learning is a very, very confusing phrase sometimes, but it is really just a computer system that can learn on its own. And it is teaching itself over time. And in many cases, what it's trying to teach itself is, how am I going to get Jazz to spend, twice as much time on her feed today? How can I get Jazz to, like, see more and more content, or to engage with more people? And it is those growth objectives, those advertising objectives, all of those metrics that provide feedback constantly, that is learning rapidly over and over and over how to be more persuasive, and in many ways how to be more manipulative. It was a complete different frame for me. Like, I feel like I'd been using social media for such a long time, and then this completely new, like, mind-shattering mindset came in and presented it from a completely different perspective. And once I saw it from that perspective, it was hard to look back at the innocence that I once felt around what social media, what I thought it was offering me.
And similarly, like Kathy O'Neill, who's featured in the film, she says the algorithms don't predict the future, they cause the future. And that to me was like such an eye-opening moment. Shoshana Zuboff also in the film talks about trading human futures. And I couldn't like wrap my head around, it's like, is this like a stock market and they're going to the stock market and we're trading, and like, what is Larissa going to do versus what is Jazz going to do? And like, that kind of seemed comical until, they would give examples of like, okay, well, we're going to decide, we're going to show Jeff ads about Stanford, but we're not going to show Larissa. Larissa doesn't get to go to college. We're not going to show her college ads. Or we're going to show Jazz things about, you can get this mortgage, but Jeff, he's actually not going to be eligible for those ads and those mortgages. So just again, like as Jeff said, this like filtering of putting you on a path. It's not any one ad that's being shown to you. It's the amount of aggregated information that they have, and their ability to say, this is what we think you're going to get, and therefore that might end up being what you actually do.
Amazing. We have a question from Maria Peak, who asks, did your interviews inform the script for the featurette story inside the film? What came first?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was in many ways, I think the interview process for us was this process of learning. And we kept meeting more people. We kept understanding what exactly is going on. How do these algorithms work? And it was a couple of our subjects that we started talking and riffing on this idea of this control room, where an algorithm is like hiding on the other side of your phone screen and it's trying to manipulate you. And those ideas kind of evolved. And so we actually were including input from a number of the engineers and executives that we met to first of all, to best understand how the algorithms are actually functioning and working. And this is something that I feel like just in general, we tend not to call them fictional portions of the film, because in many ways, all of these narrative scenes were based on the true underlying basis for how the code works. This is what we have learned about how the algorithms are actually trying to accomplish their goals against us, the humans. And even the stories that happen to the humans in these narrative portions of the film, these were based on the real world examples and experiences that we were learning about, whether consequences to individual people in the case of mental health concerns, or radicalization on YouTube. As we kind of follow through Skylar Gasando's character in the film, is watching him become radicalized through these algorithmic influences. So while these were scripted portions, but they were all really based on what we were learning from our nonfiction interviews and from the actual subjects. And the analogy of wanting to bring it out to scale and show billions and billions of these little puppeted digital avatar versions of us, that is in many ways the way I look at them now. Like Facebook has 2.7 billion digital avatars of us just for the Facebook platform. Google has another X number of billion digital avatars on Google. YouTube similarly has a digital model of you. Each of these platforms has created a model of you that is operating at scale. And it's also learning. This is where machine learning gets kind of creepy. A lot of times, people will say, oh, I was talking about this thing and then my microphone listened and it showed me an advertisement for that thing. And it's like, no, they actually, in many cases, we know this to be the case with Facebook, at least, they're not actually listening with the microphone. What's actually going on is that they could calculate this data across this entire billions of people on the network. And they say, oh, Larissa is very similar to these other 14,000, 12 people. And I see that the trends of these other people are happening. And therefore, I think that that same trend is going to happen to Larissa. And so people are talking about a particular thing and it's replicating out over the system. So the models, they just know us better than we know ourselves. That is kind of the language that many of the insiders are using now, that these algorithms will know you better than you know yourself. They know what you're interested in and they know what trends are going to be effective on people like you.
It's actually scarier that they don't have to listen to you to know how to
Right.
predict. Like that's actually, yeah, more terrifying. But I also think what was so interesting about this project, and I have to give like a huge shout out to our incredible team, because it was a process of going back and forth between editing of the documentary, then writing a script to try to fill in where we were going to have visuals to represent what was happening in the documentary, and then changing the documentary, because documentaries constantly are changing up until like the very last moment when you pull it away from Jeff's hands,
Yeah.
so that we can't change it anymore. And then going back to the script and then having to rewrite. So Jeff, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah,
but
this was
wild.
I mean,
process.
It was one of the most challenging processes because we were, in many ways, we felt like we were making 3 movies at the same time. We were making the documentary, we had this narrative like script that we were working on, but then when we merged them together, it created its own creature. And what we ended up doing, we did a very extensive storyboarding process where we storyboarded all of the scenes for the whole narrative storyline. And we edited all of that into the documentary. And we were able to feel and test out the transitions in and out of the nonfiction world. And we could see the timing and the pacing of the entire film. And we had very detailed, intricate storyboards and we were cutting them. One of our assistant editors just recorded a voiceover track for all of the scenes. And we were able to bring it to life. This actually was both a fun part of the process, but a really challenging one, because as Larissa was saying, like everything kept forcing something else to change. It was just a series of dominoes. And if we re-edited one particular scene for the documentary that changed the transition into the narrative world, we had to keep playing with that. But that proved to be really, really valuable for us because we were able to do the narrative filming at the very tail end of the whole process. So we basically had a really solid backbone of the documentary cut. We had all the storyboards put in. We were actually able to share with our actors, with the talent, what the movie was going to look like before we ever filmed anything with them. So they got to see the whole movie and they got to see the animations and the storyboards of their particular scenes that they were going to be in. So they could sort of get a sense of what the arc was going to look like for their roles. And then we were able to shoot those and then quickly add those in and edit those in and continue the massaging as we went forward. But it was a really challenging chicken and egg process where everything was dependent on each other. And that was just a real, many sleepless nights and a lot of stress in that part of the process.
Oh my gosh. Well, wow, I've learned so much just listening to this conversation. Jeff and Larissa, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and for their questions. And yes, The Social Dilemma is streaming on Netflix. And thank you to the Producers Guild and Netflix for this conversation.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Thank you so much, Jazz.
Guild, and thank you, Jazz. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.